Welcome back to the High Tech Forum podcast. We've got an excellent guest who's pretty much the world's undisputed leading scholar in the subject of digital inclusion. That's John Horrigan. John has a distinguished background, and he's currently working as a senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and also has some affiliation with the Benton Foundation. And welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks for having me, Richard. Nice to be here.
Digital inclusion, the digital divide, whatever you want to call it, is an issue that comes up over and over, and it's obviously more critical right now than it ever has been. Because when I guess when people like you first started talking about this issue, and kind of goes back to the '90s, I guess, when Larry Irving was coined the term digital divide. In the old days, people would say, well, what difference does it make how many people use the internet? It's just their personal choice. And some people like it, some people don't. So, but it's kind of has a different complexion now.
Yeah. And back then, Richard, if you're talking about circa 2000, and people did talk about the digital divide then, if you didn't have internet access, there are actually still plenty of offline alternatives to carrying out different functions. So then being excluded, had its consequences, but you could still read a local print newspaper. Now that, they're a lot smaller than they used to be. The local news media has shrunk dramatically over the past few years. And you could do shopping, at your local store. So lots has changed recently, such that offline alternatives are just much less today than they were 15, 20 years ago.
So what did you just fall into this issue by accident, like a lot of us do with a lot of issues, or was there something that that made you really want to focus on digital inclusion? Because I mean, you started this back when you were at Pew, right?
That's right, at the Pew Research Center in the 2000s. Generally what I was doing, what the project was doing at Pew at the time, was looking at how the internet is changing people's lives. And at some point along the way, and this is in part due to some background preceding my time at Pew, I started to encourage questions on our surveys that asked people who did not have the internet why they didn't have the internet. Just to see, just to satisfy some curiosity that I thought stakeholders would be interested in understanding. And when I was at the Pew Research Center, having mined that theme for a couple of years, right before Barack Obama was inaugurated in 2009, it occurred to me that for the most part, people had access to a wireline broadband option at home circa 2009. Not everywhere in the country, but estimates at the time put something like 90% of households could subscribe to a high-speed internet option at that time, probably a little bit more. And if you looked at the data, at the time, maybe 60% of people were subscribing. And when the 2009 Recovery Act was being debated, the thing I wrote at the Pew Research Center that kind of got me more deeply into this was a piece called "If You Build It, Will They Log On?" Meaning, we could put great broadband infrastructure everywhere. We in fact had some broadband infrastructure almost everywhere at that point, but we still had that roughly 30 percentage point gap between who was subscribing and who could get service. So that's what started to get me to be really involved with this topic, and in part had to do with me then going to the FCC and working on the National Broadband Plan, where my job was to try to understand why people didn't have broadband subscriptions at home, and then what we might do about it to encourage more people to subscribe.
I know one of the issues that perpetually comes up is how to interpret the survey questions. So when people say they don't have broadband because it's too expensive, how do you tease that out from the people who say they're just not interested in it?
The way I've done it in surveys, and it's what we did for the National Broadband Plan and for some surveys I did after that, is to basically do this in a two-step process in a survey. Ask people to essentially choose as many options as they would like from
Hmm.
a list of reasons why people might not have broadband. And so you include on the list cost of monthly service, cost of a computer, um, the internet's not for me. I don't have confidence on how to use the internet. I don't think there's much relevant online for me. So
Hmm.
you let people check multiple boxes essentially, and then you do a follow-up question that asks them what the most important reason is why they don't subscribe to broadband. And what you find typically is that when you read off a list of the sort that I just enumerated, people will pick about 2.5 or 3 different reasons why they don't subscribe to broadband. Cost of monthly service usually is cited. Some people say there's nothing online of interest to me, which we loosely categorize as people not thinking the internet's relevant to them. And then when you go to what's the main reason you don't have broadband, it has generally been the case that cost of service is most frequently cited. Cost of computer is cited a fair amount. Increasingly, and the Pew Research Center does this, and I think you have to have it on surveys these days. You have to ask whether people prefer their just are relying on their smartphone, thinking
Hmm.
that it can do everything they want. And a fair number of people, and a growing number of people over time, cite the smartphone as a reason why they don't have broadband. But that's the technique that I have used, which I think is a fairly reliable way to get at this issue.
Hmm. So yeah, because if you're not into it, if you just think it's a wasteland and full of criminals and
Yeah,
lies, and doesn't really matter whether the cost is $50 a month or nothing. You're just not into it.
that's right. I should say that we also put into the choice categories a network isn't available where I live, or it's
Hmm.
not adequate to make subscribing worthwhile.
Hmm.
And that's actually from the most recent Pew Research Center survey, which was 2019, is an interesting result because about 20% of non-subscribers say that there's either not a network where they live or the network isn't adequate. When you then press them on what's the main reason, about 7% say that that's the main reason that they're not subscribing to broadband. Either the network isn't there or it's not adequate to make subscription worthwhile. And that 7% number isn't too far off of what you get from other measurement techniques that the FCC uses with the Form 477 approach to try to understand network availability to people's homes. So I think that's interesting. I think it shows that the survey results are by and large fairly reliable in that they track reasonably well with other methods of measuring network availability.
So 7% seems like an awful high number if we're including satellite as one of the ways to as a broadband technology, because I mean it's pretty much, unless you live underneath a tree or on the wrong side of a mountain, uh, everybody can get satellite broadband. It's just that it's there are certain things like I guess voice I mean probably hard to do Zoom, uh, at least in an interactive way like this with satellite. But just for reading the news and yeah, I don't know. Can you really do work at home over satellite?
I think
Yeah,
that could be hard. I mean, I think the experience of satellite internet users, hasn't been well studied.
right.
Anecdotally, um, I've heard from people who have used satellite as their internet option that they don't find it to be a very good option for working at
Yeah,
home, not as reliable. So, yeah, some of those 7% have satellite service, but they're essentially saying that the satellite service, in their view, is not adequate
it's not broadband.
for, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I suppose attitudes about that may change a bit when Elon Musk and others do their low Earth orbit satellites. because they solve the latency problem, because they, the instead of a 44,000 mile round trip, it's it's, I don't know, some fraction of that. Um, but yeah, and I've actually heard some people say they think maybe net neutrality isn't the be all and end all of internet policy anymore, because with things like 5G, fixed location, and low Earth orbit, the traditional ISPs can look forward to a lot more competition than they've had to deal with in the past. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I mean, that's the issue that just won't go away. And I think, assuming that's true, that these new wireless technologies, 5G and low Earth orbit, do provide meaningful competition. That's terrific. I think policymakers will then have to think a lot differently about what kind of authority policymakers should have
mhm.
with respect to oversight, consumer protection, et cetera. But it could be that net neutrality, as we've understood it, is no longer relevant to the problems that policymakers face, or a lot less relevant, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the internet doesn't seem to be in worse shape now than it was 4 years ago.
Yeah, but and I know we'll talk a little bit about digital inclusion, if you want to think about policy measures to encourage that, um, from a policymaking perspective, in my view at least, you want to have some degree of government oversight and accountability, so that if
Hmm.
there's going to be public funding for those kinds of initiatives, um, the government can
Oh,
know
absolutely.
whether
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
being expended in the right way.
yeah. And somebody's paying for that. I mean, it's free to the recipient, but it comes out of somebody's pocket.
Yeah.
Um, which is, I wanted to ask you about that actually later on, but since it came up, funding for especially the rural, um, well, for E-rate and for rural broadband, primarily comes from a tax on phone bills, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And which is it's kind of like trying to fund a new social program today with tobacco taxes. I mean, you've got a declining pool of revenue, and how many people have. Well, does it really make sense to make, say, voice more expensive for one group of people, to make it more available and less expensive to another group of people? And how do you resolve all the equity issues? Like, and potentially you're taking money from poor people that live in urban areas where they have broadband, and giving it to fairly wealthy people, in some cases anyway, in rural areas that don't happen. I mean, they have maybe some broadband, but it's not that great. Um, it never has struck me as a really sensible way to do it. Um, aren't do you have any ideas about, how we might go about addressing that problem in a way that we raise an adequate amount of money and do it, in an equitable fashion?
Well, I mean, you're hitting the right note on universal service fund and reform of the contribution factor. I mean, it's, as you're suggesting, it's unsustainable. Something like, what is it, 18% of your telephone bill is a tax to go into the universal service fund, and that number has been increasing
Yeah, I
at,
think it's going up close to 30. I mean, it's in
right,
the
and it's
yeah.
doubled in the past 10 years, and that's
Mhm.
just not sustainable. And so I think policymakers have to start to think about how to transition away from that as the way to raise revenues for supporting universal service. And so uh, general revenues is
Mhm.
probably the place to turn, so that there would be an annual appropriation, and agencies would have to go through that process to justify that amount of money, and it would come out of general tax revenues. I suppose as more and more revenue seems to come in from the auction of spectrum, that is
Yeah.
potentially a source of funding. Um,
Yeah,
but
there's some staggering amounts of money changing hands in the C-band auction that's taking place right now. The
yeah, yeah,
last time I checked, it was over $50 billion. Of course, that
Yeah.
didn't seem like much, in in these days of $1 trillion relief bills, but I mean, it's a lot more than the expert or than many of the experts predicted. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of money there.
Yeah. But, the current universal service funding mechanism just isn't going to cut it in the coming years. So they have to, I think policymakers have to look for new ways.
You did some analysis of the Comcast Internet Essentials program,
Hmm.
which is it's sort of a comprehensive approach to inclusion, right? Because it includes both subsidized computers and as well as low cost broadband service.
Hmm.
And the eligibility is what is if school lunch program. You have kids that are
Yeah.
and a few other
Exactly.
things.
Yeah. They've expanded eligibility over time. So I think if you're a senior citizen living in senior housing units, you can get internet essentials. So it is basically very
Oh,
much still oriented towards families with
I'm gonna
school
have to
age
move
children.
into government housing, I guess.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I'm,
So, so what does it cover now? So school kids on the lunch program and
yeah,
seniors and
I think veterans, I think, as
mhm,
I said, senior citizens in government supported housing units. Um, and it might have expanded to include all SNAP recipients as well. Whatever the
not the
nutrition
company,
support,
the food stamps.
the food stamps, yeah.
Yeah.
So they have expanded, but it's still, as I said, very much about getting connectivity to school age children. Um, so
Mhm.
yeah, I did some work on that a couple years back. Have some more forthcoming in the next several months. But what essentially we did is one, Comcast was kind enough to allow me to survey Comcast Internet Essentials customers and ask them a series of questions about their experience with having broadband at home. For most of these subscribers, or at least probably half of them, it's the first time they've had a home broadband subscription. The other half have had service in the past intermittently. And so, the survey asked people questions about their experience in using the internet. The one thing we did a couple years ago was ask them whether they had any training in digital skills on how to use the internet. So you mentioned that Internet Essentials is fairly comprehensive. It essentially is built around three things: the $10 per month internet connection, so a discount internet offer, the option to purchase a computer for $150, and then access to digital skills training. That skills training can either be through Comcast or it can take place at local community institutions like public libraries. So we decided to focus a good bit on this training question. And the question was, does training on digital skills matter? Um, on the one hand, you'd think if you sat down and took some training on how to use the internet, it would have some impact on your online behavior. But it could also be that people who seek out digital skills training just happen to be pretty motivated people, and that the training itself has very little impact on
Mhm.
what they do online. Um, we built into the survey and then did the statistical analysis to try to control for people's prior levels of motivation. We basically did a instrumental variables, which gets deep into the weeds of the econometrics, to try to understand whether people were just highly motivated individuals to begin with. And once you control for that, you can then tease out whether there's any additional impact of the training on the scope of online activities that people engage in. And to make a long-ish story short, we did find that training does make a difference in that those people who do have training in digital skills are more likely to use the internet for educational purposes, for looking for jobs, for trying to improve their level of workforce skills. And we could come to that finding controlling for whether people were just highly motivated or not. So
Mhm.
um, we found that training, those investments that some communities make in digital skills actually do have a payoff.
So is that payoff separate from motivating people to sign up, or is it just that once they are signed up, they're going to use the internet more intensely than they would have otherwise?
It's once they have signed up, the training effect that we've identified comes into play. People's motivations for signing up is something we do ask in the survey, and for the target population that Internet Essentials is aiming at, a strong majority are signing up for it because they want their kids to have access to the internet for schoolwork. An interesting point connected to that, however, is that Comcast over time has started to work closely with schools and community institutions to essentially help those institutions spread the word about Internet Essentials, because the experience that you have in trying to get new services to low-income communities is that sometimes those households don't trust the people making the pitch to them that this is a wonderful new service. Research we did for the National Broadband Plan showed that low-income households, when they hear about a discount internet offer, think it's pretty good, but they worry whether that $10 a month offer is going to explode after 6 months
Strings
to
attached.
$60, and they'll be left holding the bag. So to help overcome those kinds of trust issues, Comcast and a lot of other entities work closely with community institutions who are trusted by the folks that are the target market for these services.
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess it's hard for a lot of people to understand, like, why the heck would somebody do that? But it's I mean, I suppose the surveys you did were pre-pandemic, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So you going to do any follow-up and see whether how these attitudes changed?
I hope to. Hope to be able to do that sometime next year. In the meantime, as maybe some of your listeners know, the Census Bureau has been doing the Census Pulse surveys. I don't know if you've heard about them. And they do sort of 2-week tranches of surveys, pretty large sample size, to ask people a bunch of questions about food security, about their employment status, about housing security. But also they've asked questions about whether there's internet connectivity and computer availability in the house sufficient for students to learn. And so that's helped at least understand what has changed since the pandemic with respect to the availability of the internet in homes of people with K-12 students.
Well, in the overall picture, the firms like Lightman Research that study the total number of broadband subscribers and by technology and by firm, and I mean they found an increase in signups. The rate of increase in signups increased over the course of the last year.
Yeah, for households with K-12 students, that actually doesn't show up very much in the Census Pulse surveys. Computer availability has increased for K-12 households, at least looking at the Census Pulse survey. Internet has increased a little bit, and I'd have to compare it to the Leichtman findings to see just how well it matches up. I mean, the percentage increase in the Census Pulse survey isn't that big, but that percentage increase may actually be in line with what Leichtman finds for the number of ads, additional subscriptions that they report.
Yeah, I think it may be the case that people with school-aged children already have higher rates of adoption than people that don't, especially in low income communities. You find that, right? Because it's like I think in the overall scheme of things, isn't it the case that mobile is the first kind of broadband service that people want to have? I mean, it's like mobile first, like people first, they get their cell service, and then if they have money left over, they get fixed line.
Yep, that's generally the case. Again, and this is something to explore about the pandemic, um, is whether that is still true given the demands that the pandemic has placed on households for at-home learning,
Oh,
at-home
yeah,
work,
yeah, yeah.
and all that.
Yeah,
Because mobile,
one of the little factoids about that is that mobile minutes have actually declined. Genuinely mobile usage where you're connected to the cellular network and doing things over, as opposed to a Wi-Fi
mhm.
connection at home. The Wi-Fi usage of personal devices has gone way up, and actual network usage has gone way down. So, and I guess it could just be related to usage limits. I mean,
Yeah.
which are considerably more, tolerant for fixed line services
Yeah,
than
yeah. I
mobile.
mean, you do have a lot of low-income households who don't subscribe to wireline, but they subscribe to wireless with their smartphones.
Hmm.
And there has been research that shows that the monthly data limits get eaten up pretty quickly when you have households trying to do
Oh
learning at
yeah.
home and
Oh yeah.
video
Yeah.
and all that. So
Hmm.
um, that makes the wireless, there's been a lot of initiatives to get students hotspots,
Hmm.
which are a great band-aid during the pandemic. But if those hotspots have, 100 gigabit data limits per month, that's not going to be really enough for schoolwork, especially if there's more than one student in the household.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still the case that communities that you have higher rates of mobile adoption versus fixed line adoption also have greater fluency in the mobile apps than those who don't. And so it's kind of, I mean, is that still the case? I know that was several years ago.
Yeah, I think that's generally the case. Um, One thing, and I think this was an ITIF finding, um, it's not always the case that mobile apps for certain services are well optimized. So I think ITIF
Hmm.
found that something like 86% of state unemployment websites, and they did this in the early days of the pandemic, 86% of state unemployment websites were not, or failed at least one test of mobile friendliness.
Hmm.
So that if you're a smartphone only person, you might have had some difficulties applying for unemployment, given that the website
Hmm.
wasn't well optimized for mobile users, and that I think is a real issue.
Hmm.
I think, for instance, the healthcare system has probably done a better job at being more mobile friendly because of um, the needs of a diverse set of patients. But some state websites didn't perform so well for mobile only
Yeah.
households.
Yeah, no, ITIF has long held the view that government can create demand for broadband simply by making access to government services that are essential for, you know, lots of people in many different areas, by making that sort of thing more available. But I guess it's not too surprising that they're not keeping up with the quality of mobile apps across the board. There's a lot of really crappy mobile
Yeah.
apps in the world. And
What?
I mean, Kaiser's is not really great either, but it is somewhat
Yeah.
functional.
Yeah. I, I saw you wince when I made that point that about healthcare websites. But to
Yeah.
the point that you were making about ITIF's position, um, what happens in that dynamic, and research and anecdotage has supported this, is libraries become the community help desk in that situation. So, for
Oh,
instance,
okay,
if
yeah.
the internet is the best and maybe the only way to get access to a government service, and you're a person who hasn't done it before, and maybe you're new to the internet and you don't know how the heck to negotiate this transaction, um, people go to the local public library, and librarians then bear the burden of uh, helping people negotiate those kinds of situations. So if we're going to say that, yes, government can help create demand for broadband, which it may well be able to do, you may then want to invest in the wraparound services at places like public libraries so that people can
Yeah, I'm
really
thinking
use
that
these things.
maybe this is an issue that's sort of been omitted from the adoption programs. I mean, you got the money covered, you've got the equipment covered, you've got the training on like how to use the internet covered, but there's still a lot of tech support stuff involved. I mean, there are a lot of people that are, if you're probably the designated go-to tech guy in your family, right? So,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
uh, that a resource like that, sort of somebody that can maybe even come to your house and help you figure out how to do something or resolve some problem, figure out
Yeah.
why you can't connect to your Wi-Fi router.
Yeah. And the phrase that people use for that are digital navigators.
Okay.
So some communities patch together funding, maybe from a local foundation, to pay people to be digital navigators. So this is a new kind
Mm,
of occupation for people. And it's been important during the pandemic,
mm.
so that these navigators might come to your house and help you with that tech problem
Well,
that you have.
that was a nice maybe the only nice thing about the former Bell Company monopoly was that when you had a problem, you knew who to contact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's not a clear answer for a lot
Hmm.
of people if they don't have an in-house tech
Well, and I
person.
think it's even hard for there's so many different parties that are involved in so many and their roles interact or intersect with each other so thoroughly. It's hard for anyone to know really what's to blame.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we probably all had little network problems at home and
Hmm.
computer problems. Yeah, well, great. Yeah, I've run out of questions. So I think it's thanks a lot for it's a great overview of the issue of digital inclusion and what it takes to get people involved. That helped me come up with a new insight, which is the navigators.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm really looking forward to the research you do on how the pandemic changed things for people's usage at home. I hope you got a source that can fund that, and if anybody's listening that can help John out with that, go for it, right?
I'm findable here on the internet. So
At Tech Policy Institute,
that,
and um, okay, so I'll put this write a blog post about the discussion and let people know how to contact you. Are
yep.
you any closing thoughts? Things you want to say that we didn't cover?
I think we covered it all.
Yeah. So, who are you rooting for in the Alamo Bowl, Texas or Colorado?
It's got to be Texas.
Yeah, that's pretty much my position. That's why I'm wearing my Longhorn colors today.
Yep.
Yeah,
Well, I don't have them on, but I'll fix that real soon.
yeah, okay, yeah. So for people that don't know, John went to the LBJ School for Public Affairs at the University of Texas for his master's in what something PhD in
Masters
something.
and PhD in public policy.
All right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was part of the crowd that protested the LBJ school the LBJ library when it first opened.
Well, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's too bad you didn't protest the architecture as well.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a battleship, doesn't it?
Or like a
Uh,
giant Xerox machine is sort
uh,
of what it looks like.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they have a really cool, like it's not completely life size replica of the Oval Office in there. It's like a
Yeah.
4/5 size scaled down Oval Office with an old timey phone with the buttons on it that for the different lines, that would light up
Yeah.
and it's apparently an accurate description of what the Oval looked like in LBJ's day.
Yeah. And I think like two or three of those old TVs, like the
Oh
old like
yeah,
big piece
yeah.
of
I mean,
furniture TVs.
there were three TVs, so he
Yep.
could watch all three networks at the same time
Yeah. Yeah.
if he wanted to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
He's such a colorful guy.
He was, and I worked on Capitol Hill years ago for Jake Pickle, who was
Oh yeah, yeah.
an old LBJ pal, and so
Mm-hmm.
Pickle would tell some great LBJ stories because Pickle worked with LBJ on like one of his Senate campaigns and would drive him around the state and
Mm-hmm.
do all sorts of things. So if you can get Mr. Pickle going, he'd tell some stories about LBJ that were pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some Tom Hazlett spends a few pages in the political spectrum on the licenses that Lady Bird was able to obtain. Um, yeah.
It was a different time, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, if you're curious about how we got to auctioning off Spectrum, uh, that's a good place. That book's a good place to start.
Yeah, yeah, I have it right behind me somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so great. Enjoyed it, and look forward to maybe catching up again after you've had some time to study the what now the pandemic changed
Yeah,
things.
I will let you know when we have something going.
So there you go, folks. That's a wrap.
Yeah.
This is thank you for listening to the High Tech Forum podcast. We're obviously available in all the places where podcasts are available, like iTunes and SoundCloud and what have you, Stitcher. So subscribe if you like, and even if you don't like, go ahead and subscribe. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, and
Yeah.
we're always welcome to get your comments and feedback on each of the shows and recommendations about future guests. We do these things on no particular sequence. So if you're a subscriber, maybe that's the way to get some continuity. So there we have it. High Tech Forum signing off.